In 1903, by executive order, President Theodore Roosevelt set aside Pelican Island in Florida as the nation's first bird reservation. While it wasn't the first piece of federal land to be protected in the United States, it was the first unit in what would eventually become the National Wildlife Refuge System, which today covers more than 1.5 million acres. And as bird reservations were being created all over the country, there was one particularly remote part of American territory that needed special protection. In the Pacific, bird poaching for birds' feathers was wiping out entire species, and the U.S. had remote island territories that were in desperate need not just of protection, but also of systematic scientific inquiry. In 1909, by executive order, Theodore Roosevelt created the Hawaiian Islands Reservation for the protection of native birds, and that would drive an extraordinary set of scientific and anthropological expeditions to some of the world's most remote islands. The Tanager expeditions of 1923 and 1924 involved some of the most important natural scientists in the United States at the time. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Theodore Roosevelt had been a Western rancher and an avid hunter before becoming president after the death of William McKinley, who was the victim of an assassin's bullet. His reputation was so wild, in fact, that when McKinley died, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna famously said of Roosevelt, "Look, now that damned cowboy is president of the United States." But being a cowboy who recognized the damage that poor conservation of land and wildlife had done to ranching was an essential part of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. He was called the Conservationist President and used his authority to protect wildlife and public lands, establishing 150 national forests, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 51 federal bird reserves. During his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt protected approximately 230 million acres of public land. Included in those was the Hawaiian Islands Reserve for the protection of native birds. When the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, the annexation included not just the 8 inhabited islands, but a chain of islets that extended some 1,300 miles. Created in 1909, the reserve, which was later renamed the Hawaiian Islands National Wildlife Refuge, was established to provide legal protection for the millions of seabirds inhabiting these northwestern Hawaiian islands. Writing in the journal Marine Ornithology in 1998, D.H.R. Spinneman of Charles Sturt University explained, "At the turn of the century, the uninhabited atolls of the Central Pacific Ocean were visited by Japanese feather collectors, whose actions devastated their seabird populations. An assessment of the historic record shows that between 1897 and 1914, over 3.5 million seabirds were killed on islands in the Central Pacific Ocean in the name of fashion for the millinery trade." When the revenue cutter Thetis apprehended a group of Japanese bird poachers on Laysan Island in 1910, they confiscated the feathers and wings of over 250,000 birds. The responsibility for managing this massive new bird sanctuary fell to the U.S. Biological Survey, which was part of the Department of Agriculture. And among the challenges they faced is the fact that the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands chain had never been the subject of systematic scientific inquiry. There hadn't even been a thorough ornithological study to determine exactly what birds the bird sanctuary was protecting. The idea for an expedition to do that sort of study involved some of the most important natural scientists in the nation. The National Research Council was founded within the National Academy of Sciences in 1916 against the backdrop of the First World War, which at the time threatened to involve the United States. In response to growing concerns about the lack of American preparedness, the National Academy of Sciences wanted a national organization for the coordination of scientific and technological research and development. The Council, in turn, created a Committee on Pacific Investigations. The purpose of the committee was to encourage research undertakings in the Pacific area, which offered not just opportunities in biological sciences and anthropology, but also potential navigational and military applications related to the U.S.'s remote Pacific Island territories. The committee met in Honolulu in 1920, and the discussions there prompted Herbert E. Gregory, a Yale geologist and director of the Bernice P. Bishop Museum in Honolulu, to propose a scientific expedition. The Bernice P. Bishop Museum was founded in 1889 by Charles Reed Bishop, a New Yorker who had moved to Hawaii and become a successful businessman and philanthropist. He had married into the Hawaiian royal family and had funded the museum when his wife, Bernice Pauhai Paki, the last legal heir of the Kamehameha dynasty, died, to house her family's heirlooms. In 1920, the museum held the world's largest collection of Polynesian artifacts. Herbert Gregory saw a joint scientific expedition to the islands of the bird reserve as a way to enhance the museum's collection. First, Gregory, himself a renowned geologist famous for mapping the bedrock geology of the Colorado Plateau, needed to enlist the support of the renowned naturalist Edward William Nelson. Nelson had been involved in expeditions from Alaska to California's Death Valley and had several species named after him. And in 1920, he was the director of the Biological Survey. Nelson appreciated the importance of such an expedition to the Biological Survey, but he also worried about funding, arguing that appropriations for the Biological Survey from Congress were only for specific purposes. But he realized that this expedition would become much more viable if he involved another unit of the U.S. federal government. The ship for the expedition would be provided by the United States Navy. Nelson knew that there was a strong argument that the Navy had much to gain from an investigation of these islands that were so close to their Pacific base at Pearl Harbor. Moreover, Nelson hoped that by involving the Navy, he would be able to meet another goal of the Biological Survey, and that is to expand the expedition beyond just those islands that were part of the bird reservation. In February 1923, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture wrote a formal request to the Secretary of the Navy, arguing that the expedition would result in the accumulation of considerable information valuable for the use of the Navy. The Navy assigned a Lapwing-class minesweeper to the expedition, one of 49 such vessels built during and after the First World War. Vessels of the Lapwing class were, appropriately for the expedition, named after bird species, in this case, the USS Tanager, giving the expedition its name. To the delight of both Nelson and Gregory, the Navy approved the use of the vessel not just to the islands of the bird reserve, but also to Midway Island, which was not included in the reserve as it was under contract to a telegraph company, and the outlying atolls of Wake and Johnston Islands, despite Wake being a nearly 2,000-mile voyage. The Tanager would be captained by 27-year-old Navy Lieutenant Commander Samuel Wilder King. King had attended the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, but had another unique qualification for the expedition. King had been born and raised in Hawaii, and was of native Hawaiian descent. 4 trips were planned for 1923. The agreement was that the Navy would be responsible for collecting and charting hydrographic data. The United States Biological Survey would provide an ornithologist, a specialist in the destruction of rabbits to eradicate an infestation on the island of Laysan, and a moving picture operator. The Bishop Museum would provide any other personnel that might be considered desirable. Alexander Wetmore, an ornithologist with the Biological Survey, was assigned as the lead scientist and responsible for the scientific team. The initial trip was to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands of Laysan, Pearl and Hermes Atoll, Midway Atoll, and Kure Atoll. Biologist and wildlife photographer Donald R. Dickey was to accompany the expedition as the official photographer. A survey biologist from Arizona named Charles E. Reno was assigned to eradicate the rabbits. A handful of other scientists, including experts on insects and mollusks, rounded out the scientific team. In a historical footnote, one of the biologists provided by the survey, with expertise in ornithology and herpetology, was an Army officer named Chapman Grant, the grandson of former President Ulysses Grant. To illustrate the tight budget, the Secretary of Agriculture stipulated that subsistence expenses should not exceed $5 a day. That is approximately $26.50 per person in today's dollars for food. Laysan is small, a little over 900 acres. It was described as low-slung, often barely above sea level, and an important destination for birds of the Pacific. A particular concern on the island was rabbits. As a destination for birds, the island had been rich in bird guano, used for fertilizer. The guano had been removed by commercial interests, but they had left behind an ecological disaster. Someone had brought 2 pairs of rabbits to the island, hoping they would become a supply of food. The rabbits bred like, well, rabbits, but the population stayed in check while the guano was being mined as they were hunted for food. But when the guano ran out and the miners left, the population soared. The Biological Survey had already tried to eradicate them, but did not get them all. The rabbits ate all the vegetation, which both denied food to other wildlife, but also made life on the island almost unbearable from blowing sand. Nelson hoped the expedition, which would be given a month to eliminate the pest, would solve the problem once and for all. He wrote to Charles Reno, "The destruction of rabbits on Laysan is a very important matter. I hope you will be able to actually exterminate the last rabbit on the island during the month which we have devoted to that purpose. Failure to do so would be a great disappointment to me and would necessitate another effort at considerable expense." To support the endeavor, the survey provided Reno with 125 ounces of strychnine, 2 tons of alfalfa to poison with the strychnine, 4 .22 caliber rifles, and 15,000 rounds of ammunition. The rabbits, which had likely caused the extinction of multiple native flora and fauna, were successfully eliminated after more than a month of effort. The island, once described as literally covered by myriad sea birds, was nearly barren. Whitmore said in National Geographic magazine, "From all appearances, Laysan might have been a desert." Laysan still represents a cautionary tale about the impact of invasive species. It was on Laysan that the expedition witnessed a rare and tragic event. The Laysan honey creeper, a species unique to the island, had been driven to near extinction, as the rabbits had consumed nearly all of the plants from which the birds could derive nectar. When the expedition arrived, just 3 specimens were found. A strong storm hit while the expedition was on the island, and after, the scientists were able to confirm that all 3 had succumbed to the storm. In a rare event, scientists had actually been present to witness the extinction of a species. This brief film by Donald Dickey represents the last photographic evidence of a beautiful species. At least 2 other bird species, once common on the island, had also been driven to extinction by the rabbit devastation, the Laysan millibird and the Laysan rail. The expedition collected a massive amount of biological samples. On Laysan alone, they picked up 8 boxes containing seal skulls and skeletons, seal skins, bird skeletons, and eggs, small bird and mammal skins. Further expeditions in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands discovered not just new species of birds and plants, but hundreds of anthropological sites representing Polynesian culture. The sites were cleared and mapped, and artifacts, including human remains, were taken to the Bishop Museum. The discoveries resulted in another trip in 1924 to further investigate the archaeological sites on the island of Nihoa, which once was home to a native Polynesian population of several hundred. 2 ships were taken for the expeditions to Wake Island and Johnson Atoll, with the Lapwing-class USS Whippoorwill joining the Tanager. The thorough surveys of the islands not only served vital military purposes, as both islands would prove important during the Second World War, but offered a unique opportunity, as both islands were so changed by the war that had the expedition not gone at this time, we would likely have no understanding of the original environments, flora and fauna, of those islands. Despite the significance of the discoveries, publication of the findings of the expeditions has been comparatively light, limited largely to an article in the July 1925 edition of National Geographic. That has largely been attributed to the fact that Alexander Wetmore, who had overall responsibility for publishing the results, went through a number of rapid career changes and advancements shortly after the expedition. Still, the discoveries were published slowly over time and offered an unprecedented new understanding of the ecology of these remote islands and proven invaluable in ongoing conservation efforts. In addition to the scientific discoveries and military applications, the expedition included some of the most important naturalists in America, who among them have dozens of species named in their honor, authored hundreds of journal articles, and became leaders in their fields. In 1924, the superintendent of the National Zoological Park died suddenly, and Alexander Wetmore was chosen to replace him. After just a few months in that position, he was appointed assistant secretary at the Smithsonian Institution and placed in charge of the U.S. National Museum. He would go on to become secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Considered one of the most important naturalists of the era, some 56 new genera, species, and subspecies of birds, insects, mammals, mollusks, amphibians, and 1 plant bear scientific names given in his honor. He passed away in 1978. Donald Ryder Dickey, a noted and prolific biologist and scientist, would be recognized as one of the greatest nature photographers in history. He collected some 50,000 specimens and produced more than 7,500 photographs and moving images of natural subjects. He passed away in 1932. At his death, his collection of bird and mammal specimens was the largest private collection in the United States. Chapman Grant was a founder of the Herpetologist League, founded the journal Herpetologica, and published the journal Scientist Forum. 2 species of West Indian snakes were named in his honor. He passed away in 1983. Samuel Walter King, captain of the Tanager, became the territorial governor of Hawaii in 1953. He was the first native Hawaiian to become governor of the territory. A species of miller bird discovered on the expedition was named in his honor. He passed away in 1959. Kenneth Pike Emery of the Bishop Museum was the anthropologist who cataloged the sites on Nihoa. He became one of the preeminent anthropologists regarding Oceania, and was a leader who helped to shape the field of anthropology over a 70-year career. He passed away in 1992. In 1997, as a result of the 1990 Native American Remains Protection and Repatriation Act, the Polynesian remains that had been discovered by the expedition on Nahoa Island were removed from the Bishop Museum and reburied on Nahoa by the native Hawaiian group Hui Malama. One of the scientific stars of the expedition was the U.S. Biological Survey, which eventually became the National Fish and Wildlife Service, and today employs more than 9,000 people, protecting some 1.5 million acres from 700 field stations. Continuing efforts by the service have helped to reestablish bird populations on Laysan. In 2006, President George Bush, by executive order, gave the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands national monument status. The Papahuka Mokaeke National Marine Monument, covering some 580,000 square miles, is among the largest protected areas in the world. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.